The prisoners were led to the convoy. The majority of the troops continued to search the area. A part saw to the removal of the cargo. Suddenly, an entire division of foot soldiers and heavy trucks pushed through the thicket like an army of ghosts. Among them were strangely oval and streamlined vehicles with cannons, retro-futuristic tanks, rounded in their angular design. When those showed up, KLEIO noticed that the engines of their vehicles made virtually no sound. A hollow hum hung gently in the air. The human body barely registered its frequency. Wherever the energy that kept them running came from, she doubted that it was from internal combustion engines. Following the vehicles was a whole brigade of far more bizarre machines, headless, humanoid robots, all in anthracite and detailed in the colors of their uniforms. On their chests there was a window, and KLEIO saw that behind it sat a pilot, wearing the iron monster like a suit. On two legs, they moved around, which ran into several hydraulic legs on the ground. Chromed tubes were connected by struts to wires and plates. At the feet, there were blades and heavy guns above the shoulders. The primary weapons, however, were attached to the arms. Two huge and heavy funnels, the purpose of which KLEIO would not have guessed, had she not experienced the effect firsthand. They acted like satellite dishes, cone-shaped, though not like receivers but transmitters.
Some kind of sonic weapon?
She wondered. Had sound waves caused her muscles to freeze? Their technology seemed advanced, even if the design looked half-baked, like the World War II fantasy of NSDAP science fiction writers. KLEIO couldn't dwell on it any longer. One of the soldiers pushed her and forced her into the transporter. Between her fellow sufferers and two soldiers, she was squeezed in while a third closed the tailboard, knocking 4 times before the truck started moving without a sound. Over a poorly groomed gravel road, it was felt that the engines may have been silent. The ride, however, was just as shaky and uncomfortable as it would have been with a gasoline engine. Despite all the advancements, they had skimmed on the seat upholstery. The bumpy ride stretched through overgrown territory, past abandoned buildings, destroyed and burned down, so that the majority of them were standing half at most. A civilization of ruins. Rubble and ashes created the breeding ground for a new beginning, that no longer seemed to care about us. What perished between the people at the front reclaimed Mother Nature, from which they all sprang. Her landscape designers decided what came out of it. Only little that was created here by man's hand was still in its original place. The hierarchy of chaos ruled. Its rule had been established with bombs. KLEIO got only little insight into the outside world. Through a gap in the tarp, she saw virgin forests bordering a battlefield. How the path soon gave way to a paved road, foliage and timber, yet more destruction. The more civilized it became, the more the misery circulated. Hooded people walked through the alleys. A steady increase in traffic suggested that they were driving into a city. On the way, they passed at least 7 security checkpoints. Uniformed soldiers always checked the truck before moving on, everywhere they drove, and armed patrols drove and walked everywhere, while barbed wire fences were erected on all sides. They entered urban areas that were spared from major skirmishes and remained intact. All the more it was under control. Dystopia and utopia were direct neighbors. Which of the two which was, became relative. Immediately, KLEIO was deprived of the prospect, when one of the soldiers pulled the tarp, because he didn't want her to see what was going on outside. Even the small sightseeing tour was begrudged to her. A metal flask sparkled up from the soldier's vest pocket. He took it, unscrewed, and tipped the contents down his throat. His comrades watched the process as KLEIO did, but were more invested in what it meant to them. His counterpart accepted the flask and poured the sin. He who does not know how to chastise himself must be chastised by his neighbors, remarked the third like something that hardly came from him, and with a stern face. The owner of the flask showed amusement.
Drink. It's still early.
A nip before the start?
The fourth affirmed, joining in their sacrilege. Get that out of here, said the pious indignantly.
Well, sure, I see. Alcohol ban. The plague of ice bat.
retorted the soldier to whom the bottle belonged to. He took another sip, distorted his face, and pocketed the substance again.
Then we'll drink beer later.
Apparently, there was something of a decree against alcohol among them, that merely a quarter of them obeyed. The verbal minority, while in the case of beer somehow seemed to be an exception. Beyond that, KLEIO couldn't really figure out anything useful from their exchange. She was looking elsewhere because she overheard her fellow captives whispering among themselves. She sat close enough so that she could eavesdrop unnoticed. They probably hadn't even realized that KLEIO understood everything now, and how could they? She herself didn't want to admit that she understood them perfectly.
Where do you think they're taking us, Brina?
The young man asked the robed woman.
Looks like they're taking us to the center of Kaltoin. From what I hear, they've turned Oak Park into a fully functioning labor camp. You can say what you want about the Laxarian bastards. They know how to build slaughterhouses out of thin air,
She replied with bitter recognition.
And what have we put everything on the line for? Her?
He wanted to know incredulously.
For that, we've had to endure 1 month of preparation and a week of fasting. You do realize that it's a matter of days before we starve to death? If the rumors are true, it is the most pleasant death that awaits us there. For an ordinary woman who doesn't even understand us. She seems like a nice girl after all, Brina. I hope you'll understand if I don't like to expose myself to the experiments of the Laxarians.
KLEIO liked his sarcasm, could understand the frustration, as she couldn't possibly be what they hoped for in this situation, except for the difference that she understood these people by now. She was indeed as lost as she appeared. And as the man alluded to what lay ahead for them, filled her with an entirely new and unknown horror.
Don't be so hard on her, Emery.
The woman named Brina defended her.
I'm sure she was brought to us for a reason that escapes us now.
She sounded disproportionately confident, as if she truly believed what KLEIO herself dared to doubt.
I wish I shared your faith,
Added Emery with similar pessimism. Suddenly, one of the soldiers harshly bleated in.
No talking! What's going on?
Asked another beside him. The Tauridians are plotting something against us, he surmised. The other looked angrily at the prisoners. KLEIO also detected a fear in him as he raised his index finger admonishingly.
If I sense anything suspicious from anyone here, I'll slit their throat.
Regarding KLEIO, his threat certainly achieved its effect. Less so with Brina, the Taudian and sworn enemy.
I heard your father took a high number with your mother.
She said in a friendly tone, smirking. It was enough to mislead him. He did not register the meaning of her words, but seemed to smell a rat.
What did you say?
He demanded to know angrily. His entire body language indicated how physical he wanted to make the argument. Cool it, 815. Another soldier conciliated. The Tauridians just like to talk. We'll beat that out of them. I spat willing. This argument calmed the brawler, and he leaned back, seeming to inwardly imagine what lay ahead for the Taudian traitors. Far stranger than that they addressed each other by numbers, which could be military code, was that for KLEIO both parties were now speaking the same language while not understanding each other. She did not even wonder how exactly this went about, took it as another feature in this plot line of insanity. The van passed through a steel gate and came to a standstill in the wide gravel lot in the courtyard of the facility. According to Brina's statement, it had to be the aforementioned Oak Park. Most of the oaks had been felled recently, only a few still justified the name. Now the park consisted of clear-cut and meadow areas. A whole tent city was erected on it. Rough buildings from sheet metal, steel and wood constructions, in which the oak found new use. So too, in watchtowers. Every 20 meters they pierced the wire mesh of the fence, the barbed wire that was stretched over it. The future prisoners were assigned a number at the registration desk. A large crowd lined up in front of the tent. A queue of slaves, such as she was, slaves of their captivity as well as their bureaucracy. A man at a strange typewriter machined the new workers off as if they were on a treadmill. Even more than with his compatriots, their mechanical way of speaking came through. Is Taudian or Laxarian better for you? he asked KLEIO when it was her turn to speak. She shrugged. Uncertain in what language he was inquiring, he continued, unperturbed with the procedure. Since you could not be assigned to a specific region, we have assigned you the number of the district in which you were picked up. Memorize the number because you will be called several times a day. This also applies to the food counter and the washroom. Also, you must be able to identify yourself when you start and leave your shifts. The correct designation for you is as follows. 0037866901. I repeat, 0037866901. Nod if you understand and repeat the number. For support. He nodded to it himself, articulating overly clearly because he thought she would not understand him. If the circumstances had been less oppressive, she would have found this office guy somehow amusing. He was the depressing product of his system, loathed his profession, and yet practiced it while taking out his displeasure on those who roamed his turf.
0037866901.
Then sign here to acknowledge that you accept the protocol. He handed her the fountain pen and pointed to the document with his hand. Only briefly did she pause to imagine what would happen if she did not consent to the contract that this gentleman was about to conclude with her. There, she set the point already on the paper and signed obediently with her full name.
KLEIO.EXE.
The chances were slim that anyone in this world had ever heard of the Vignes, let alone that she would encounter any relatives here. The newcomers gathered in the gravel parking lot. Apparently, it took little to fit into the enemy image of the Laxarians. Arriving with her were dozens of others. Among the people, KLEIO saw her fellow Tordian sufferers. So far, there was a ban on talking. None of the prisoners knew when and if it would be lifted at all. All were handed a grey-blue overall. They could only be distinguished by the numbers embroidered on their backs and chests. Thus, it represented a small miracle that she found the three at all in the crowd. They had lost their individuality. Names were replaced by numbers, clothing by uniforms, and freedom of speech by silence. As the property of the regime, they were subject to its arbitrariness. A grim contemporary read off the numbers from a list, and each prisoner had to report as soon as he called his. Deliberately, KLEIO waited as her number was called, just long enough not to attract negative attention, and long enough to assume that she did not immediately understand hers. The first four were identical for all of them, so it was enough to remember only the last five. After that, the prisoners were assigned to their quarters, inside huge communal tents. More than 1,000 people had to be accommodated in them, neither cleanliness nor free space or any other trace of human dignity. KLEIO doubted that even one Laxarian had to put up with such a shithole. She moved into a cot near her Tordian allies, the only people she trusted here, without knowing if there was any reason to. For the next few days, she experienced firsthand, or on someone else's, what it felt like to work to the brink of exhaustion. Seconds turned into minutes, minutes into hours, hours lasted days. Never before in her young life had she been pushed so close to the edge of collapse, and beyond, so that she was increasingly plagued by microsleep when awake, during cleaning or loading and unloading various vehicles, doing laborious gardening or unskilled work in the workshops. She deliberately avoided the washroom, except when it needed cleaning. She decided that in a place like this, it was better to be dirty and stinky than to look like a flower and smell like one. That way, even if she should one day shower, she wouldn't put too much emphasis on cleanliness. Whether it was because of that, or because of the discipline of the Laxarians, so far, they left her alone. With the work she was struggling with, a shower would soon have become a blessing. The cleaning work led her into the warehouses, where she scrubbed floors on all fours and with dirty rags. Often she was surrounded by the war equipment of the Laxarians, trucks and vehicles, and the strange tanks stood parked, forcing her to crawl under them, leaving traces of grease all over her body. In one hall, she found the metal monstrosities from the Laxarian arsenal. Armabellum 415, the soldiers called them. The machine that kept them from escaping. An entire battalion stood by, inert. Although the Laxarians undoubtedly used electricity, she saw no charging stations for the monstrous weapons of war. They were far too quiet for fuel engines, and besides, this technology would have consumed vast quantities of gas, for which she did not see any corresponding tanks. Did they operate on some sort of nuclear power? Again, a sophisticated cooling system would be needed. Their construction was crude and seemed almost primitive, taking into account that it was a mechanical suit half the size of a tank that fired sound waves. Its power source, on the other hand, could be anything but backward. It was impossible to investigate further. As long as the guards were patrolling around, she was under constant observation. It didn't stop her from thinking about it. The Armabella 415 were enhancing humans as something like an armored exoskeleton that was only animated by a pilot. According to Laxarian teachings, those were also just machines. However, if the body was a machine and the brain was the control center, then who operated it? In the case that nobody was in charge, when, how, and by whom were these processes automated? The philosophical dilemma became clear to her with the contemplation of this machine, a grotesque image of its creators. They were forbidden thoughts, which she could not pursue for long. When the guards became aware of her, she continued with her duties like one of their machines, interchangeable and soulless. Every day they held mass for Icebat in the morning and evening. It took place in a kind of chapel of oak built by the followers of his religion, with considerably more devotion than their quarters, about which none of the prisoners who knew better complained. Those who did disappeared without a trace. The doctrine of the Laxarians was taught strictly and without any discourse. It was enough to listen to the priests. In their fanatical monologues, they elucidated to the prisoners their erroneous beliefs, the superiority of the Aspasian faith. All of them were brainwashed by their program. They made thrive by repetition. The prisoners were allowed to raise their voices only for prayer.
O sacred All-Father of Icebat, Icebat the prophet, seed of your wisdom, first vessel of your omnipotence, we pray to you, Son, who gave birth to the Father on earth. We renounce all the errors of humanity. We vow to live according to the scriptures, which you have recorded in your blood, the vowed blood that made you shed the shell that separated you from your creation. Hear us in your word of the first and last truth. What was yesterday, is today, and will be tomorrow. We are your vessels, poured by you, O Almighty. We are the empty shell that is filled by your Spirit. We are the storm that is strengthened by your breath. We are the seed that is tasted by your fruit. We are the reflection that is seen through your gaze. We are the sword that is wielded by your hand. We are the song that is heard through your word, the number of your name, the sum of your wisdom, the infinite forms of your power. May your fire burn within us, and preserve us from your wrath. May your enemies be consumed by it, and your warriors be steeled in it. The will of Icebat is, Icebat willing.
Such and similar prayers brought KLEIO closer to their faith. At first glance, it consisted only of prohibitions and punishments. In many ways, the writings of their savior Icebat and his followers reminded her of a dogmatic interpretation of the Christian faith, albeit less merciful and bloodier than Jesus. She got the impression that the writings of Icebat constituted the Old Testament version of the New Testament, with the son/prophet of a vengeful God, who were so similar that a direct kinship could be assumed with certainty. KLEIO pitied the people who had to live by the draconian rules of this faith. Herself, and her fellow prisoners, whom they were forced to pretend they had been converted. It was recommended if one preferred to live. Some of those who refused because of their conviction or other reasons were never seen again. KLEIO had the necessary imagination to picture what awaited them. She herself did not find the hours of prayer so tedious, at least not unbearable enough to become a martyr. Even if they had to kneel most of the time, the masses became a period of rest for her. She just had to make sure her half-dozing remained unseen, which once or twice almost became her undoing. Her Tauridian allies woke her up at the right time. Many of the inmates already turned to the other extreme after a few days, as if they had renounced their previous convictions, as if all that they had grown up with was just a lie. The brainwashing of the Laxarian Empire was efficient. The integration of new followers was even more effective, as they got rid of anyone who dared to question the cosmic role of ISPAT, a divine dictatorship. Unceasingly, the structuring of the imperial apparatus revealed itself to KLEIO, their submissive, blind obedience, the unspeakable bureaucracy they maintained. Not all prisoners who attracted negative attention were immediately shot. After all, they were resources. Executions took place mostly as a deterrent, if someone, at their discretion, transgressed the rules too much. Usually, disobedience was punished by torture or humiliation, which was often demonstratively performed in front of the prisoners, also as a deterrent. In a particularly effective form of chastisement, they confined wrongdoers for days in a small and completely darkened box, only to pour ice water into it once a day, and unannounced. Logically, KLEIO avoided attracting negative attention like the plague, no matter what. In a strange way, the methods of the Laxarians seemed familiar. It seemed that techniques of any kind, no matter how disgusting and cruel they were, also prevailed in other worlds, as long as the efficiency was right. Why had she been stranded in an Orwellian dystopia, of all places? Why had she not been allowed to stay with her father for days? She cursed how unfairly fate had treated her. The situation ensured that she cried herself to sleep every night as unnoticed as possible. After a week, KLEIO was allowed to take a diatech for the first time. This was something of a confession for Laxarians, with a touch of psychoanalysis and more technological than the Vatican. It took place in a transparent but soundproof glass house. Inside were 2 chairs and an apparatus. The one who took the diatech from her had on Vespasian robes that made him look like a priest, in the same blue of their flags and uniform and the symbol in whose middle sat the Messiah. Overall, it was closer to an interrogation than the confessional booth. KLEIO was distantly reminded of lie detectors, as they were known from movies, though more sophisticated with switches, dials, and displays. Sensors were attached to her forehead, the back of her head and neck, and she was given bracelets made of metal and a peculiar composite stone. She had to place her hands over a steel disc afterward, and was startled when the box was turned on. The bracelets were heavy, and were now repelled by a gentle force, so that her wrists hovered above the disc. A hum escaped the device, similar to the motors from their war gear. The priest asked questions without looking at her, reading responses off the instruments. She answered passively, under the spell of the machine, wondering how it worked.
Anti-gravity? Magnetism? Electromagnetic oscillations? Mumbo-jumbo? Abracadabra?
She made conjectures that sounded more and more like New Age gibberish, without any of them having real application, right?
Something from Tesla?
A tingling sensation spread from her fingertips to all the limbs and became more intense, before the soldier suddenly turned off the machine. He had been silent longer. The displays had to be telling enough, and what he saw there seemed to disturb him, although he tried not to let it show. He printed her values out on paper and bid her farewell. KLEIO didn't know where the inkling came from that her values were abnormal, and he broke off to notify his superiors. It was a 7th sense that told her, the same one had told him. No night before there was more justification to cry than the one following the diatech. Despite all efforts to make herself invisible, she had been noticed. Half asleep, images of what would happen haunted her. The full moon shone like a cosmic searchlight on the prison camp. KLEIO tossed and turned restlessly on the hard cot, unable to find a suitable position, which finally brought her completely into the realm of Morpheus. She sobbed before a prisoner next to her, who only a few days ago had been an infidel, ordered her to be quiet for Icepat's sake. She did not listen to him. Could not. The restlessness was driving her mad, and when she felt the touch on her shoulder, she already thought that the prisoner was coming to get physical, or that the Laxarians were coming to experiment on her. However, the touch was too gentle. She turned, and in the dim light saw Brina standing, her Tordian allies just behind her.
What's going on?
Asked KLEIO, thinking until just now that she was wide awake in bed. Now it became apparent how close she was to slumber.
We're leaving now.
Brina whispered.
Get up. We don't have much time.
The boy Emery strode to her and shook her awake.
You understand us, don't you?
He asked less patiently.
Then get the hell up now. And follow us.
He may have been whispering, but the sharpness of his tone pierced the night's silence. KLEIO was already becoming more awake as a result.
How are you going to get out of here?
She inquired.
The guards are everywhere. What about the fence?
It's all taken care of.
Brina reassured her without explanation as to how in the world they had done it. But KLEIO trusted her, and mutually it was decided that a gut feeling was enough. She followed the only friend she seemed to have in this place. Undetected, they crept from the tent village past the work sites at a less than Icepatian hour. Further ahead, some guards sat together. They were drinking and playing games, indulging in the vices that their savior had given them, only to be enjoyed in frugality. Their sacrilege became an advantage for the fugitives. Instead of the 5 securing the territory, they preferred to sin, which was fine with KLEIO and her allies. It was to be hoped that all the guards neglected their duties, be it merely today.
Of course.
Thought KLEIO, as she remembered how they were praising a holiday in today's mass. Until now, they had heard little of it. Only now, the Laxarians were in a more festive mood. Logically, the Tordians chose this day for their escape. The priest had told about it during the mass, how some saint of the Icepatian faith had performed some miracle on this day of their calendar 200 years ago. The story might not have been very memorable. That did not matter, as long as the Laxarians remembered it in that tradition. The escape route led past their table. Somehow they had to pass unseen, not far from the Laxarian gentleman's circle. Several transporters were parked close together. They provided enough cover. Only the gaps between the trucks would expose them in places. Emery stood lookout at the edge, signaling whenever he felt the coast was clear, and they bridged the passages piece by piece. Brina dashed ahead, practically marching through. KLEIO worried she would be seen, but the men were too engrossed in their card game. Next came the short-haired girl. She, too, slipped through nimbly like a ninja behind the transporters. KLEIO looked at Emery, and he made frantic head movements, indicating that it was her turn to hurry up. She lacked the guts to run straight through like the 2 women had. To be precise, she only got as far as the first transporter of 3, where she stood rooted to the spot. Suddenly, it seemed as if the tension had made her freeze. The boy lacked the patience to wait any longer, and closed in on her.
What's the matter? Move.
He pressed her, which did little to relax her.
I don't know what's wrong.
She explained, fearing.
I think I am having a panic attack.
Her breathing was erratic. Gradually, a tingling sensation rose to her fingertips.
Definitely a panic attack.
She realized, trying to exhale calmly, which she managed to some extent, but did little to change her condition.
Are you kidding me?
The boy asked, glancing over at his companions, who were waiting for them at the last transporter, looking over uncomprehendingly. He performed a whole series of gestures, trying to communicate with them. KLEIO had a hard time understanding how he thought, in the dark at a distance of an estimated 100 meters, to describe the complex situation with a show of hands. What he was doing hardly resembled sign language at all, but rather a wild flailing.
Hey, What is that over there?
They heard a guard exclaim, and their escape was uncovered unexpectedly.
Run!
Shouted Emery, and his sister was already running ahead with Brina as he followed with KLEIO. There was no shooting for now at least, but the wild barking of dogs resounded. They ran over a hill and came up to the fence a bit further away. A spot was cut open, just enough for a person to crawl through. Behind it waited a car with the engine running. The vandal was at the wheel of their getaway vehicle. Brina was already standing by the car and Emery's sister was waiting at the opening.
Asta, what are you doing?
Asked Emery.
Get moving!
I wanted to make sure you don't get yourself killed because of her, too.
She replied hostilely, and let him go first. He took her up on her offer without a word, and squeezed through. KLEIO was not entitled to the same honor. Asta pressed forward but did not get the chance. Again, an invisible force paralyzed their limbs. Those of KLEIO, Asta, and Emery on the other side of the fence. Brina was spared. Approaching from the car, she and a stranger came up to Emery, grabbed him and carried him to the vehicle. Brina turned to face them before she got in, had to leave them behind. KLEIO and Asta could only watch as the car drove away, unable to move, at the mercy of the guards, facing punishments for such a violation of rules. Stay tuned for weekly chapters. Like, share, and subscribe for more wacky adventures. We thank you for your support.